Welcome aboard, everybody. I'm super pumped to have Holly with us today. So Holly Ridings is NASA's Chief Flight Director, and we're just really thrilled that she's here with us. Before I pass the floor or the Zoom on to Holly, just a couple of words on MoHo. First of all, my name's Stacey. I'm the moderator for today, and I work on MoHo Communications as well as Schoolab, one of the partners for today's talk. MoHo was born from an observation that more than ever we must work collectively to overcome the enormous challenge that that today's political climate is facing. MoHo's ambition is to initiate a second D-Day dedicated to positive impact, to refer to the 1944 World War II Normandie landings in France, where thousands of young people landed from 12 countries. Our ambition is to recreate the D-Day, but for positive impact, as a platform to find solutions to some of the big contemporary challenges that our current world is facing. MoHo's focus is on inclusion, climate change, and digital transformation. MoHo will bring together students, artists, entrepreneurs, athletes, and companies to create this incredible space across 7,000 square meters in Caen, Normandie, which will be opened in June 2021. For anybody who's not familiar with French geography, Caen in Normandie is northwestern France, not far from the English Channel. The MoHo Talks, which is what we're here for today, was sparked up as a project during the first lockdown when the entire world was bunkered down because of COVID-19. The idea was really to shine light on change makers and how their extraordinary experiences will help us to circumnavigate the future world post-COVID-19. Above all, in 2020, I think all of us are just looking for inspiration and a way to connect, and this is the idea behind the MoHo Talks. It's our pleasure to kickstart the second season of the MoHo Talks with Holly. So welcome aboard. I know that everybody's mics are off, but I'm sure everybody's clapping in the comfort of their own home. But thank you very much for being here. A big thank you also to our partners for their support on this event. So we have Makesense, Makesense, SoGood, Raiselab, Schoolab, and finally Vivatech, that Holly you know particularly well because you happen to be a speaker at the event in 2019. So Holly, I'm so thankful that this talk has finally happened. Holly, for a bit of context, shared me some lame excuse last time about a rocket launch and why we couldn't do the last talk. If I had excuses like that every day, I think it would make my life easier. But we're really glad that we could finally make it work today. So thanks for being here. My first question for you, Holly, is as a Chief Flight Director, what does that really mean? What is your typical workday like?
Okay, so first of all, thank you so much for having me, and you know, I appreciate your flexibility. You know, when I describe what the typical day for a Chief Flight Director is like, the first thing you need to know is that it can be really dynamic. So as the Chief Flight Director, I'm responsible for all of NASA's human spaceflight operations. The most obvious example of that is the Mission Control Center at the Johnson Space Center here in Houston, Texas, and that's where I'm talking to you today. I'm actually at home, but JSC, Johnson Space Center, is right across the street, and Mission Control is today full of people and has been even with the COVID-19 pandemic since the pandemic started back in March. And so we've been able to keep up a steady pace of human spaceflight activity. And so one of those did in fact impact the previously scheduled date, which was our Crew-1 launch. You can think about human spaceflight operations in a couple of big groups. One of them is the International Space Station. So it's been on orbit over 20 years. It's been manned or womaned, if you want to use that term, but had astronauts and cosmonauts on board for all of those 20 years. And so we support those crew members on board and take care of them and the vehicle, the space station, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. We also then, of course, bring crews to and from the space station and cargo and supplies. And it, in fact, was one of those missions, the Crew-1 mission. So the second launch of our commercial crew vehicle that SpaceX built for us, the Dragon, that went to the space station. The other big piece of human spaceflight operations right now is Artemis, which is our campaign to get back to the moon and then onto Mars, putting the first woman and then the next man on the moon by 2024. And so that is a lot of stuff. And I have a team of just over 25 flight directors, and we do all of that every single day. So the very short answer is every day is different.
It's a super program. There's lots of things on your plate, I can imagine. How long has it been that you've been working for NASA, and what inspired you to take up your role there?
So I started with NASA not long after I graduated from college. So this is like 1997, 98 timeframe, right? So if people want to do math in public, that's over 20 years. I didn't start out as a flight director. I love operations. It's kind of where the engineering overlaps with the human aspect, right? The communication, the decision making. And so I started out learning operations, being responsible for different systems on the space station, and then ultimately became a flight director. So I've been doing this type of job for over 20 years. When you talk about, how I ended up here, what inspired me, everyone has we'll call that an origin story, right? Why do you do what you do? At least I hope you have an origin story and you're passionate about what you do. So for me, I was young, about the 6th grade, and I'm from the Texas Panhandle, right? So the state of Texas, and the square at the top of Texas we call the Panhandle. So I was in the 6th grade, and we watched the shuttle launches live back in that time frame. So this is the mid 80s, and got unfortunately to watch the Challenger explosion happen live. And you can probably see it on my face. It's still hard to talk about it. Sitting there, remembering, right? You're in the 6th grade, and we had those, black and white TVs that rolled out on the carts into the cafeteria. And, I realized not long after that I wanted to do something that would help prevent it. And when you're that young, you don't really think, I want to be the chief flight director, but you do think, hey, I want to be an engineer, and I want to be able to solve those kind of problems and prevent those kind of problems. And so that was really the beginning of my love of human spaceflight and my drive towards ending up where I am today. And it's still hard for me to look back and think about it and what happened. And since then, of course, NASA's experienced another tragedy. I actually worked here when that happened, although it was many years ago, and I was not a flight director yet. So human spaceflight is very risky and very hard, and it's our responsibility to keep it safe.
It's a beautiful story. I do have an origin story, but I would say that my job is probably a little bit more typical than yours. And I wanted to know, us regular mortals, we often refer as to an easy task on saying, don't worry, it's not rocket science. I really want to know what kind of term or job do people in your industry refer to?
Gosh, that's a really good question. People do that a lot. Oh, it's not rocket scientist. Oh, wait, but you really do rocket
science. Yeah.
Yeah, we don't really have a term that we refer to when something's difficult beyond rocket science, but it's definitely sort of an inside joke where if we're trying to describe something difficult, we actually use rocket scientists, but then it's got that sort of, oh, but wait, that's us. We're supposed to solve this problem. So that's kind of how it goes.
Yeah, I guess you've probably achieved the pinnacle of difficult tasks, difficult jobs out there. So there isn't much more challenging than your job, I can imagine. So you mentioned the recent Crew-1 mission with SpaceX. Can you give us any behind the scene insights of how it happened? How did it go? I mean, we all watched from the comfort of our own homes, the launch, but you as an insider, did anything exciting happen that we weren't aware of?
To me, it's kind of all exciting. So I'll try to pick out something that you guys would think is interesting. Just to understand the big picture, many years ago, NASA decided and still is in the process of really focusing on, the commercialization of low Earth orbit and really helping the industry grow. And so picked Space Exploration Technologies and the Boeing company to build spacecraft to carry NASA astronauts and our international partner astronauts and cosmonauts to and from the space station. So We flew a demonstration mission with no crew in it. And then after that, we flew a demonstration mission, a flight test, if you will, if you're familiar with that term, this past summer. And so not long after the pandemic started in March, we decided we'd go ahead and do, one of the hardest things we've done in many years at NASA, which was to, put our crew members on this brand new vehicle, and that was May. And so we completed the flight test. Those crew members, Bob Bank and Doug Hurley, came home in August. And then just several weeks ago, we launched the first, what we think of as, the operational mission, the flight test being where you kind of do all the checkouts. It's the first time, you've had your spaceship out on the road. And so you do a bunch of extra kind of shakeouts in order to make sure it works correctly. So this is the first operational mission. Again, if you've got technical background, you often certify a product or a capability. So now it's certified. So we put Ike Hopper, Soichi, and Shannon on the vehicle. We do what's called a dry dress. And so the crew members all suit up and get in the cars and go out to the pad. The rocket's not fueled, the spaceship is, but the rocket's not fueled. And they go through all of the different aspects of what it's going to be like to launch. And then, several days later, we do it all again for real. One of the fun things, if you watch the live stream, the crew members all get to pick for their crew what's called a 0G indicator. And so for Bob and Doug this past summer, they had a sparkly dinosaur because their sons, they each have one son, actually picked out the sparkly dinosaur, and its name was Trimmer. And so for this crew, we were all kind of waiting, and it's a little bit of a reveal. What is the 0G indicator? And it was Baby Yoda. So just things that are fun to us, that are a little bit behind the scenes. Spaceflight is very serious and very difficult and very technical, but there's a human piece of it, that is about teamwork and emotion and bonding. And so if you watched the live stream, there was a Baby Yoda reveal. So we're all sitting in mission control going, "Yay, Baby Yoda!" It was a lot of fun.
That's good. I think it's important to keep it light, as heavy as the space flight is.
Yeah. I mean, you're sitting on top of a fully fueled rocket that could, so you've got to try to humanize it a little bit, right? And keep it light.
Very seriously. Holly, you're the first ever woman to be the chief flight director. Can you share anything on gender equality in your industry?
Yeah, so it's been really interesting. I did not necessarily set out to be the first woman chief flight director. I just wanted to be the chief flight director. And so NASA does really an amazing job of not making a big deal about it, right? You work hard, you get promoted. And so I've not had at NASA any real experiences of getting, sort of stopped on my path because of gender. What's been really interesting about becoming the first female chief is now that I know that that's really true a lot of places, right? Because people have told me, and to have, visible people like me and many others in these jobs really provides an opportunity for that conversation. And so for NASA, I would say, absolutely, it's a focus in terms of all forms of diversity, right? Whether it's gender, ethnicity, backgrounds, and we think about it technically as well, right? About rockets, about spaceships, about engines. So we do a lot of diversity and inclusion at NASA, and always have. But it has been really fantastic to then have an opportunity to meet and talk and be a role model for many, many other people who maybe haven't grown up in such a positive environment that I have from a professional standpoint. I'm the oldest of 3 daughters. And so I also, just from a personal standpoint, really never had any limitations, from my own, personal background and culture. And so I honestly, when I first got this job, was surprised a little bit, that there is so much out there. But as you start to maybe grow is the right word for me, be more comfortable with that, being a role model, you do realize that it's a really important message. I also, I have a son, and so I am very obviously partial to females and gender, but it's just as important, that I am a role model for him and all the little little boys out there as well, right? So that it becomes commonplace, many years from now, and well, hopefully not too many.
Sure. Yeah, I think I can see his drawings behind you, right?
Oh, I was trying to get them out of the shot. Yeah.
It adds to the scenery.
Yeah, those are older, but yeah, they're definitely his.
The United States has recently elected their first ever female vice president. Does that impact anything on your role or the way that NASA operates?
Yeah, I think that in terms of impacting my role, right, it's just now a tremendously visible, exciting example, for the country and the world, right? So back to representation matters, and you can see yourself in those type of jobs and those responsibilities. I think for NASA, again, our head of human exploration at our headquarters level, is a female. The head of our Orion program is a female. Our deputy center director, is a female. So we inside of NASA have had a lot of representation, and I think we'll just continue to go in that direction. It's one of the things that's just very, very important to us as an organization.
Okay. We've had lots of excitement about this talk before today, and we had a couple of questions sent in through a local high school.
Okay.
Some senior students at the high school, which is called Cours Notre-Dame, which is in a town called Douvres-les-Délivrandes in Normandy, not far from Moho in Caen. The students, they're in senior year and they're doing English class. They're covering a topic called Space as the Final Frontier. And the English teacher, Cecil, has sent in a few questions. One of the questions from the students is, do you feel any frustration sending other people up into space? Would you sometimes like to swap positions with the members of your team or with the space crew?
That's such a fun question, right? So our organization, right, our flight operation, actually includes the flight directors like me and the astronauts. And so the chief astronaut kind of works hand in hand with me to do a lot of our preparation and flight readiness, or I work hand in hand, with him. And so we joke with those guys a lot, the astronauts, guys and girls, that it would be fun to go. I will tell you, when I was young, what about NASA is astronauts, right? That's what you see. And so I definitely said, I want to be an astronaut. Once I got to college, kind of actually where the students are kind of end of high school and into college, I started to realize that my niche or my gift or my skill is really building teams. Like, I love to build teams of people that work well together, instead of sort of being, the single visible, the astronaut is certainly part of your team, but they're also this sort of single visible entity that you rally around. And so for me, I started to differentiate between wanting to be an astronaut, and go into space. At the same time, I will tell you, if somebody called me tomorrow and said, "Hey, Holly, we've got a seat, would you take it?" Absolutely. I would get on the rocket and go. And so it's not necessarily a us versus them, but I do think all of us who work and support human spaceflight, or at least many of us would absolutely love to go. So we kind of joke about it internally, but it's more for fun than anything else. But at the same time, if any of you guys, know somebody who's got a seat, let's go, let's do it. And, I say that because there's a lot of commercial work going on in human spaceflight. And I think that certainly for the students, there may be opportunities, right? I mean, there'll be NASA and all of the, European Space Agency has astronauts as an example, but there also may be other ways to get into space, which I think is a positive for everyone.
Okay, brilliant. So you touched on teamwork, teams, which makes a perfect transition to my next topic, and
okay,
here today to talk about teamwork. I think 2020 has been a particularly challenging year, either for us working in the corporate world or even for students having to learn or work remotely. Every day, I can imagine that you've been doing this for quite a while, speaking to your astronauts hundreds or even thousands of miles away from space. How has this year tested you to work with your teams differently?
Yeah, so teamwork is a big topic, right? I mean, the first thing when we talk about teamwork, we talk about trust. So NASA itself is a big distributed system. Like, it's pretty complex. We have different NASA centers, different places in the United States. So we're here in Texas. Florida is where we launched from. Our headquarters is up in Washington, D.C. Our payload operations is Alabama. So just as an example. And then beyond that, for the International Space Station, we obviously have partners all over the world, right? So European Space Agency, I mentioned, the Russian Space Agency, Japanese Space Agency. So, we have all types of teams. So being a good team member, actually becomes kind of a skill, because the team changes. I mean, every single meeting I'm in is a different team of people. It might be talking to our international partners. It might be talking to our commercial providers, Boeing or SpaceX. It might be talking to just the flight directors, on and on. So I do think that this year, some of the skills that we already had, because we do work a lot with people that are geographically distributed all over the world, right? Telecons and video cons. And if you sit in mission control, you wear a headset and you have, voice loops, and you push one and you talk to, the person running the Japanese team, the Japanese flight director, just in your headset. So we had all of those skills. The piece that is difficult is the trust you build face to face. And so there was always a component of doing work with people face to face. And we're still sort of borrowing from what we did before the pandemic. So I still know most of the people I talk to all around the world. But as time goes on, you start to have new people come into roles, and now you're talking to people on the other end of your headset, or the other end of the, the video con that you've never met face to face personally. And I think that gets harder. So when you consider the future, I think we have a lot of the processes set up, and they work well for us. But what absolutely has to happen face to face, because it's critical, and you need to look someone in the eye and say, hey, this is risky. Are we really ready to go do this? We're figuring out what of that we need to maintain. And then as time goes on and new people come into the projects and the missions, how do we build that same kind of trust with them when maybe we haven't spent any time, or certainly not as much, with them face to face, because you just can't really replicate that, looking at you on the video con a little bit, but not much. So I do think that we're in a really thoughtful time, in terms of creating this sort of hybrid solution, between what works well. Now, we're always talking to the crew members, right? Again, and mission control, and they're far away. We do the same thing. We use video, and we see them floating by. But we know them, right? Because they train in Houston, we train with them. And so again, we have that face-to-face connection that we rely on when we're seeing them on the video. We can't pick up all the details of the body language and the eye contact. So does that answer your question?
Perfectly, thanks. And I think one of the challenges would be keeping your teams organized, because with such a challenging role and so much going on, how do you go about organizing the teams?
I'd say from a leadership perspective, it probably takes more trust. So for me, so I'm first of all, I'm a big delegator anyway. Like I trust people go do their job, right? I mean, what we do is just too much stuff, too big of a breath for me to just, look at every single detail every day. But when you're all in the office together, you do pick up a lot of information, just walking down the hall, and people stop in, and you can look at their faces and see if they need help. So it does take a lot more dedicated effort to continue to reach out. And it's almost like, if you have kids in a car, are we there yet? Are we there yet? Are we there yet? You have to kind of ask them, are you okay? Do you need anything? Are you okay? Do you need, almost to the point where I feel like I'm bugging them, right? But you have to continue to reach out, because you just don't have that data coming to you naturally. And I think it's easy for people to just sort of get lost. They could be over here doing their job and they're doing a perfectly good job, but you actually haven't seen them or talked to them because whatever their assignment is, this doesn't cross with, what I'm focused on as the chief. And so trying to remember to continually circle back and reach out. So as a leader, that is a new, algorithm in my head that I was kind of getting for free when we were all together. And I think as introverts, a lot of engineers, if you've met some, are introverts. You probably wouldn't believe that about me, but I am. That's hard because it requires energy and time to just, push the Zoom and talk to somebody. And again, I was telling Stacy before this, I'm trying to look at the camera so you guys can see me, but naturally I want to look at her, and I like it. It's a little bit of extra energy. So trying to teach ourselves all of those skills as leaders, because it really, really matters. Otherwise, I think your team members can just get lost from a personal standpoint. There's no collection point, and humans really need that anchor.
Sure. You touched on yourself being an introvert. Is that something that you look for in your teams when you select your flight directors? Is that a criteria to make things smoother, or do you also opt for a mixed team with both introverts and extroverts?
Yeah, so I would say in the flight director office, and again, there's a 25 to 30 typically. It's actually a mixture, which is really good, because you've got to have someone to like plan the Zoom happy hour thing, which by the way is not me. But like someone needs to do that, right? And or whatever works for your team, right? Someone needs to be excited about doing this thing. So you absolutely need a mixture. Really what we look for, the first one is the trust, right? Do you feel like you can trust them? And some of that is how they answer questions in an interview, and some of that is the body of work that they bring to applying for the job. Some of that is, body language, how they'll fit in with the team. It's interesting because we were talking about everybody doing remote work, but how you fit in with the team is just as important, if not more important, because you're just seeing these windows into everybody's lives. And so if you don't have the same sort of goals and work ethic and, belief system in terms of your professional job, it can be challenging. And so we look for that, are they able to be part of a team? Team, again, like I said earlier, team is a skill. And then I'd say, technically, obviously you have to understand things technically, but you have to be able to communicate them to a wide audience. You could talk about valves and engines in super detail, or you could talk about valves and engines at really, high detail. And the one we've kind of added, because we were in the process of selecting flight directors, is really adaptability. And so up to now, when I've run the flight director office, most of the things we've done, I've got some kind of experience with. But when you talk about going to the moon, I mean, I haven't worked on a project to go to the moon. That's older than I am, right? And so we're all kind of learning it together. And that's a different type of structure than a traditional hierarchy. Your boss is smart, they kind of have information for you. Now everyone is all learning together. And so that's a different type of person, that adaptation, that ability to just sort of go out and do the right thing without a tremendous amount of direction. And that's a really hard skill to find in people.
Sure. We've got a couple of questions. We've got one from Jean-François. Do you think that team management will be one of the big challenges for long-haul trips to Mars? So you talked a little bit about Artemis and the moon. I can imagine it's even more challenging for a potential mission to Mars.
Yeah, so we've actually talked about it some, and it will change. So in low Earth orbit, it's basically like me talking to you. There's a tiny bit of a delay, but you can barely tell. So if Stacy's on orbit and she has a question, hey, where do I put this box? I can't remember where it's stored. She can call me and I can say, hey, put it in, the cabinet over there. But on the way to Mars, there's a delay, right? I mean, you're up into the 20 plus minute time frame. So you both need more autonomy from the crew standpoint, where they can do things and solve things on their own. and also an understanding of how you're going to manage that difference in time for the communication. And so you still have a team on the ground, and you still have your team on orbit, your crew members. And I think that how we do it today in terms of the crew members forming a cohesive unit and the ground team forming a cohesive unit, the part that's going to be challenging is how are they a cohesive unit together? What parts are not important anymore? Like, you probably don't need to call me and ask me where to store the thing, even though I'm used to that and I want to have input on the ground. It's probably okay. But there's also really important things, and now you have to manage this time delay. So putting them together will be challenging. We've run some tests on the space station and kind of pretended that they're far away and there's a 20-minute delay, and we're trying to solve a complicated technical problem just to see what it looks like, and try to understand what we need to equip the crew members with to do on their own more, what we need to be prepared to tell them when there's a time delay and you can't just keep calling and calling and calling.
Yeah, it sounds like patience will be a very, very special skill to have for these missions. We've also got a question from Sylvie, and to anybody else, feel free to post your questions directly on the question and answer section. If you're not comfortable asking in English, feel free to do so in French, and I can translate. So Sylvie is asking, how would you recommend teens of today to learn such skills that you've touched on?
Yeah, so also a really good question, and that one we've spent some time on, right? So before the pandemic, you would do a lot of events and activities, right? You could, and I'll just use a sort of a non-technical example. You could go to an escape room and you could practice communication in a semi-stressful environment, and only because I did that with some 9-year-olds. We rented out a whole escape room, and anyway, it was semi-stressful. So you could do things like that, right? You could send your people to conferences to work on communication. You could, gather all of your team members, together for face-to-face meetings. And so I think that in the future, it actually gets a little bit more challenging. And so I'm a believer in the hybrid system, where you can't ever completely replace all of the virtual for the face-to-face. I think that companies like the virtual, it's cheaper in a lot of ways, right? You don't need big office footprints. People don't need to get on airplanes. But I personally am a proponent of keeping an amount of critical face-to-face. And so, when you assume the pandemic's over and you can be face-to-face in close proximity, I think you're going to have to really carve out some dedicated time for those team skills, because then it translates back into the virtual environment. Different companies do it better than others. We've always done a fairly good job at NASA at doing some of the individual stuff. Like I said, I'm an introvert. I've taken some tests, but focusing on the team skills, I think we all can focus, can do more of that in the future.
Sure. We've got a question on the same topic from Guillaume. Given so many tests before launching with so many teams, how can you be sure to ensure the right persons get the lessons learned?
So that's a really good one. Before we launch, we have what we call a flight readiness review process. So I think of everything in my head kind of as a timeline. So, if your launch is here and you start, here's your flight readiness review process. And it starts at the very detailed level of all the subject matter experts for the hardware and the software and all of the systems, and it builds. Okay, you built the engine valves and you say you're good to go. Okay, now the engine's good to go. Now the rocket's good to go. And so you go up through all of these flight readiness reviews until you're ultimately ready to fly. What we do at NASA in flight operations, I think fairly well, and very much like the military, is a lessons learned process. So a debrief process, and we do it in mission control. Like if you go run a simulation for 8 hours, then there's 30 minutes of debrief. So that we call that like immediate feedback, right? Real time. And then if you run a mission, so you've now flown the launch and the docking of the Crew-1, well, then that team, and actually just 2 days ago, got together and said, okay, well, now that vehicle is still on orbit, but for this much of the mission so far, what have we learned? Because the next mission of that type is coming in the spring, in the April timeframe, and they want to make sure that everything they captured, gets put into that. So we call that our lesson learned process. it's built into our culture to be really harder on ourselves than anyone else would be. And so as flight directors, it's part of our responsibility to train the new folks coming in to, you know, be honest and be open and admit mistakes. You know, there's no place in space flight for you know, not talking about that stuff and being humble about what you know and what you don't. And so it's some process and it's some culture, and that's what we do. And it's one of, in my opinion, the most important things that we do.
Sure. So you're talking about mistakes. I wanted to move on, which I think, I mean, you've talked a lot about trust. I think stress and learning how to manage your stress is an important skill for team cohesion. I think for teamwork, you need to know how to manage your stress. And I can imagine your job must be so stressful. How do you manage it to not get overwhelmed by potential mistakes that can happen?
Yeah, this is where I think, you know, the pandemic has really challenged everyone on a personal level. So you've got personal stress. So me, Holly, as the chief, I have my personal stress. And then I have, you know, the stress of my team and my team members, right? Both as a whole and then as individuals, you know, that I try to manage. And so on a personal level, I think the pandemic has challenged all of us, right? I mean, just things, at least where I am, aren't completely up and running. And I'll give you a simple example, like going to the gym. I mean, we try to stay in sort of semi-quarantine because we're around the crew members that are flying, you know, and so, you know, I like to go to the gym, but now I don't go to the gym. And so, you know, as a simple example, that is something that has been hard to put back in my day, you know, differently than it was before. So I do think I talk to my team a lot about trying to manage it on an individual basis. You know, we're trying to get people to take time off, which sounds super easy to do, but it's actually really hard to do because, well, okay, I'm supposed to be taking the day off, but I'll just turn on my Zoom and this meeting will run in the background and then I'll kind of know what's going on. And but it fatigues your brain, right? Because you're not taking a real break. So then there's the group stress, right? So we used to, and I'll give you another example, we flew the Demo 2 mission this summer. This is a huge achievement. We've been working on it for years. We had not put astronauts in a new vehicle for, you know, almost since the shuttle, right? So that's 1981. So it's been almost 50 years since we put crew members in a new vehicle. This is a big deal. And then we get done, and instead of being able to come together and celebrate and sort of release some of that stress that we'd all been carrying, you know, through the launch, through their stay on orbit, and then the entry, descent, and landing is very, very, you know, stressful. Like we couldn't do that because of the pandemic. And so everyone really felt the loss of that. And so I think that there's not really any way to fix that. There's nothing that can replace it. But again, back to what I said about the leadership and checking in, you just then have to keep checking in with people individually. I do think that if this goes on for long, it'll, you know, people are going to start to struggle. So I think you first have to manage it individually. And then if you're a leader of a team, no matter how busy you are, you have to carve out some time to really try to manage that stress of your team. Some of it is just, hey, I'm going to force you to take a break. Some of it is, I might have to change your assignment. You know, some of it is, hey, let's socially distance and at least, you know, sit on a balcony somewhere where we can at least see each other face to face. We've used all those different mechanisms.
Sure.
That's all.
You spoke about the difficulty of getting to people take breaks. I must remind you that here we have a mainly French audience, and I don't think we have the same approach as Americans to taking time off.
You guys are, but it's good. Actually, I admire your approach. Like, Americans do not do good.
Yeah, it's a different way of working. If you can compare the two cultures. I have another question from our lovely high school students. Having such responsibilities for other people's life must be pretty overwhelming. Do you sometimes consider that responsibility as a burden to your own life?
You know, that's an interesting question, and the short answer is no. You know, when I got picked as a flight director, I remember going up to mission control and kind of sitting there, right? Because every time you walk in the building, like you kind of know, it's almost like you put on your jacket, like, okay, you know, I'm now responsible. And I think if you decide to do this job, that's something that you accept, that you sort of wear around or carry around with you, everywhere you go. So to me, I've actually never considered it a burden. I think when I made the decision to try out, to apply for first the job as a flight director and then the job as a chief, to me, it's more of a privilege that I had a choice, and I asked to be given that privilege to be responsible. It is serious, right? I mean, it affects your whole life. People talk about, and again, you mentioned that the audience being French, and so American's not super great, in my opinion, or maybe me personally, at work-life balance, and this job maybe makes it a little bit even harder because there really is no separation. I mean, you sleep with the phone by your bed. It really does go off in the middle of the night. If something bad happened in the next 5 minutes, I would hang up with you guys, get in my car and go across the street and call my husband and tell him, I don't care what you're doing, you have to come home and watch our 9-year-old. I mean, it takes priority in a way that few other things do. And your family understands that, and you sort of just accept it if you're going to be willing to do this job.
No, it's an honorable job at the least, that's for sure. I wanted to move on to international diplomacy. You touched on some of the partnerships you have with the European Space Center, the Japanese Space Center. I just wanted to know, how does it really work in terms of collaboration? You mentioned the handsets and the technical solution that you have in place, but how does it work, the collaboration between all these other countries?
Yeah, so there's a couple of ways to think about it, right? So every day there is a team in mission control here in Houston who's watching the space station, and then there's also teams. There's a control center in Japan, outside of Tokyo and Tsukuba. There's one in Munich, so Oberpfaffenhofen. So that's kind of the main ESA control center, and then Russia, so outside of Moscow and Korolev. And so those are kind of the big ones. There's one in Canada as well, the Canadian Space Agency. So at any given time, you walk in the control center and all those places have their teams in mission control, and you can talk to them again through your headsets in order to be operating the space station. How it works though in terms of collaboration is you build up to, that's just one small slice of, everybody goes and does their shift today. Really what happens, each international partner really brings a piece to this, or many pieces to the space station. So for example, let's take the Japanese. They have a cargo vehicle called the HTV, and we fly that cargo vehicle to the space station, once every year and a half. And so they assign, a lead on their side, and we assign a flight director, and then they become a team. And so a year or so before the actual mission happens, when you're all sitting in mission control, they form a team, and then they have team members that represent, the cargo and the systems and the engines, and they plan how it's going to work. We're going to launch on this day. We're going to stay on orbit for this long. We're going to carry this much cargo. We're going to transfer it to the space station and back. The HTV actually has an external pallet that you use the robotic arms and move things outside. So you plan all of that. So you spend, a year, sometimes 2 or 3, working towards building this relationship with the leader of the international team. And then you practice simulations, and then each other. And again, when it's not the pandemic, built into that process is a couple of trips, one to Japan, one here, where you get to know each other a little bit face to face. And so if you've done that as long as I have, 20 years, you've gone through that process, a lot, at which point then you kind of now know, their leaders, and they know your leaders. And so when you show up on console, you actually know a lot of the people. So you've got the very focused, what you see in mission control, and then you have all of these sort of parallel lines for all of the missions that are coming towards the space station. I mean, we do 12 or so vehicles every year. And when you consider arrive at the space station, leave the space station, something's happening, 24 plus weeks. Well, there's 52 weeks in a year. So basically every other week. Now it doesn't quite fall out every other week because of orbital mechanics. They tend to sort of group together. But every other week, somebody is coming and going to the space station, and you have the people that have been working that, for a year or so. So those are kind of the two big forms of collaboration. Whenever you bring in a new group who's never flown to the space station before, or like I mentioned, Artemis, no one's ever flown Artemis before. So you're bringing in a new group, that process is a little more intensive in terms of the relationship building up front, which we've been trying to continue to do even in the pandemic. And it's been, challenging, like I mentioned before, but we've still made quite a bit of progress, because that's a lot of it's almost like, because most of the audience is French, when you bring in a new company, they have their own culture, and you can almost think of it like speaking a different language, right? So if I was to try to talk to you in French, it would be not very good, because my French is not very good. Luckily, you guys all understand my English. Sometimes if you bring in a new company, they don't understand sort of NASA's spaceflight language, or maybe we don't understand theirs. And so you have to spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to teach the other person the language, or find someone who can translate. So bringing in a new group is challenging, but it's really fun. It takes a little bit of a different process.
Yeah. I've visualized this mapping of all these components. Where does SpaceX fit into it?
Yeah, so SpaceX has sort of two, we'll call them, functions or contracts with NASA for the International Space Station and low Earth orbit. One of them is to take cargo to the space station. So they've been taking cargo, no humans, back and forth to the space station since 2012. That was the very first mission the cargo mission that we flew was in 2012. And so we're actually, hopefully on Saturday, so today is Thursday, 2 days from now, going to try to launch the number is 21. So they've done 21 and actually a demonstration. So 22 of those since 2012 cargo. Then they also have a contract with NASA to carry crew. And so that's the one we already talked about. That was the Crew-1 mission, with Ike Hopper, Sweetchi, and Shannon. So those both service the space station in low Earth orbit, one for cargo and then one for people. The other big piece of collaboration with NASA is for Artemis and for the human landers. So Artemis, right? You've got to have a rocket, and then you have the vehicle, that's Orion, that carries you through space, and then you get close to the moon, and then you have to be able to get down to the surface. So the lander is the part that gets down to the surface and then brings you back. There's also a gateway that acts kind of as a hub where you can dock the Orion and dock the lander. So that lander, there's a couple of companies, and SpaceX is one of them, who have some sort of early contracts with NASA to work on the lander designs. So there's multiple places where we work with SpaceX across the spectrum of human spaceflight.
Okay, we have one question regarding SpaceX from Michelle. NASA has signed a few months ago to use the Starship, a new vessel, in the trips to the moon. Do you the Starship project personally?
Yeah, so that's the third one I just mentioned, right? So the cargo, the crew, and then the lander, right? So their proposal is to use the Starship as the lander down to the moon as part of the Artemis program. And so yes, in the flight director office, we have flight director leaders of each of the operations teams that collaborate with the companies. There's actually 3 companies. SpaceX is one of them. Blue Origin and Dianetics are the other 2 that have those contracts that she's mentioning. And so yes, on a daily basis, I talk to them, to work with them.
Question from Jean-François. Does it ever happen that you just simply lose contact with astronauts during their flight to the ISS?
So yes, it doesn't happen very often, but yes. So we communicate with the astronauts really in 2 ways in low Earth orbit. So there's ground communication, right? So you're physically over a ground station, and you can have sort of, line of sight to talk to them. But most of the time we use what's called TDRS, Tracking Data Relay Satellite System. They're in geosynchronous orbit. So if you have the Earth and you have low Earth orbit, geo is way out here. So the satellite has a lot of coverage of the station going around in low Earth orbit, but it's not perfect coverage. So we do have what's called an LOS, a loss of signal, when we don't have a TDRS available to see that part of the orbit of the space station, or if we don't have it scheduled because other people use those communication satellites. You also can have failures. And so if a communication satellite, the TDRS, has a failure, you might lose communication with them. Or if the space station itself has a failure of its, communication box or system, then you won't be able to talk to them. We have a couple of different ways. If you're from a technical standpoint, an S-band frequency, a KU band frequency. So that gives you more options to talk to them sort of only if one antenna fails, but the other one's working, if one box fails and the other one's working. So we do occasionally lose communication with them. In the early days of space station, more than we do now. Now that it's fully built, we have a lot more capability. In the early days, it happened a little bit more. And, if you're a flight director, it's kind of fun because that's when you get to do your job, right? You get to solve problems, right? But that's kind of the multi-piece answer to your question.
Yeah. In terms of sustainability, we've got a couple of questions on what NASA's doing to manage sustainability out in space. Do you believe the increasing number of low Earth orbit satellites might become an issue for NASA's work in the coming decades?
Yeah, so there is a lot of stuff going on in low Earth orbit, and so that's generally positive for everybody on Earth. But I do think managing everything that's out there. So there are companies that are starting to figure out how to catalog those things and help all of the commercial providers know and understand where they are. You obviously don't want anything to collide in space, right? And so we do have a process where if we need to, we can move the space station out of the way. It's called a debris avoidance maneuver because you are avoiding the potential debris. We don't actually have to do it very often. You hear a lot in the news about the addition of satellites and things, and it is a lot, but space is also really big. So we don't have to do this debris avoidance maneuver, think kind of once or twice a year, not once or twice a week. So not very often. When you're talking about the future in terms of the debris and micrometeoroids, there are a lot of folks too who want to be able to sort of repair satellites that are on orbit, and so that's sustainability, so that you don't just have to launch a new one and then the other one sits there as junk. So there's companies that are working on that aspect as well, which I think has some hopefully real possibilities in the future.
Sure. I wanted to touch on your relationship because I know that you met your husband at NASA, a workplace romance, and I believe the stat is that 50% of relationships are formed at the workplace, but I must admit it does sound a bit better when you say that you met your potential partner at NASA. It does sound a little bit better than any other workplace. How do you both manage working for such a high intense environment? How do you manage to not to not bring all that stress and potential baggage to your home?
Yeah, boy, that's a good question. It's interesting because I mentioned earlier, at least for us, it's kind of a lifestyle. I think there's two types of people, right? There's the type of person who, your spouse probably does, nothing like what you do. And so they don't understand the industry you're in. So you don't talk about it. That is not our house because, we both work in the space industry, and, his project right now is to try to build a commercial space station. And so it's, very, very stressful in its own right. So, we try really hard to talk about work some because it's a shared interest and we each have our insights into the industry, but we also then I think work really hard to kind of set it aside and do some other stuff. We've cultivated friendships sort of outside of the industry, and that's actually become more important during the pandemic in our small pod, so that you're not just surrounded by work all the time. Now those friends still ask about space, but it's like talking to you guys a little bit different than, sort of debating some very technical thing, with your spouse that you might not necessarily agree. So I think that, the way we do it, friendships are important. Kind of just saying time limiter, now let's do something else. Our son gets a lot of exposure to space stuff. And so he's a good forcing function because we want him to be well-rounded. And when he starts, drawing the only space stations on the whiteboard, we're like, okay, well, maybe it's time to change the topic of conversation. And so he's a good forcing function to help us talk about other things that are going on in the world. So those are kind of the three things that come to mind.
Great. We've got a few minutes left. I just wanted to ask one last question on my end, and then I'll ask a few last questions from the panel, from the questions. You're the Chief Flight Director. What on earth could be next for you in terms of your career? I mean, you've kind of like reached the summit. Is there anything? I saw yesterday that a recent astronaut, Mark Kelly, is to be sworn in as a US Senator for Arizona.
Yep.
Is that kind of the potential perspective that you can have post NASA?
So for me personally, probably not politics. Just, let's just put that out there. Although I admire Mark. I mean, that's amazing for him to want to go and give back to the country that way. But for me, probably no. It's interesting. There's different schools of thought about career, development, right? Some people have a plan. I want to do this specific thing and this specific thing and this specific thing. I'm more about, I want to do, something that makes a difference, right? I want it to be relevant. If I'm going to spend, so much time and energy and you have your family sacrifice, I want it to be really relevant. I think I want it to be fun, right? And this job is really stressful, and every once in a while my son will be like, do you really like your job, because you're grouching too much at home, but for the most part it really is fun. I mean, every day you get to just do amazing things that hopefully again have relevance for all of humanity, now and years beyond. So to be relevant and to have fun, and ideally it'd also be something that you're good at, right? So that you're doing a good job along the way. So what's next? It's a good question. I've found that I really love developing people. And so the flight directors, come in, we'll call it mid-career, and all of the things we've talked about, that I don't know the answers to, but how do you develop teamwork, and especially how do you do it now? There's so many interesting questions. So I don't know. There's things at NASA you could do. I mean, you could go and you could, our organization, flight directors and astronauts, and then we have flight operations, so there's that job. You could go and work in one of the programs and lead one of those. All of those are potentially really interesting, but I have to admit, I really like where I am right now. It's a great job.
Okay. That's good to know. We've got just a couple of minutes left. I'll take 2-ish additional questions. So quickly, NASA is working on the Artemis program. China landed its probe yesterday on the moon to find a good place to send future missions. Is the spirit today still the same as before in terms of the conquest of space, or will you be working for the next missions to moon with the same space agencies? With the question is the spirit the same as it was with the first moon launch?
Oh yeah, and so to that I think you mean maybe more competitive with the other countries in the world, right? Or maybe more specifically China. I get asked about the Chinese quite a bit because they're not one of our international partners with the space station or with our collaborations that we have for Artemis. That being said, it's a global economy, and so in terms of technical progress, I think that's positive for humanity, right? So I actually personally don't look at it in terms of competition. There is room in space for all of us to make progress, and so just because our partnerships don't right now include the Chinese, I wish them well and congratulate them. And getting a rocket to the moon is hard, and so I think that is positive for all of humanity that they've made progress. So I think the answer then would be I don't look at it the same way as when we did the moon the first time. I look at it as really a team effort, and then we've got our teammates that we've had for the space station and will for the Gateway and for Artemis.
Sure. Final question from Jérôme. What kind of future for Earth do you personally hope in these spatial explorations?
That's such a good question. I do value a lot, the international aspects of the space station, right? So, I have friends all over the world, and I understand, their cultures and their challenges and their perspectives. And I think that that's one of the best things about human spaceflight and its relevancy to all of us is, how it brings all of the Earth together, and we're all excited. I mean, 10 million people watched Bob and Doug, live actually to space last May. I mean, people are excited about it. So there's such a huge benefit in terms of bringing us together. And then there's the space benefit as well. You ask about sustainability, and so the idea with Artemis is you get to the moon, but beyond that, then you put a sustainable base on the moon so that we don't just go and then fall back, like we did before. Now we go and you maintain a presence, and then you push forward, onto Mars. So for me, I hope, and I'm working really hard personally to make that happen, so that my son is 9, and so when he's our age, they will have permanent presence, and they will then be pushing farther. So you get the benefit both here at home and then out in space as we explore and learn.
Lovely. Thank you. We've run out of time, but thank you so much for your time, Holly. It was wonderful to chat with you. Big thank you to everybody for your questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get through all of them, but I hope everybody appreciated the discussion as much as I did. Really, I'm just really thrilled to have spent this hour with you. There is a talk. We have a talk, future Moho Talk on the 13th of January with Thomas Landru, who is a researcher in synthetic biology, who has turned to entrepreneurship. He's the co-founder of Just One Giant Lab, the first ever research and innovation lab operating as an open and massive mobilization platform for volunteer-based task solving. So that will happen in 13th of January, and you will all receive a link to the event in the coming weeks. It's your lunchtime, Holly, so I have a great lunch. It's our dinner time here in France. So we'll leave everybody on that note, but thank you so much for being with us today. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and hopefully everyone found something of interest today. It always helps me get excited to talk about space with people. So you guys helped me out, and I really appreciate it. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Okay. Thank you, everybody.